My parents pressured my girlfriend to leave me for my wealthy cousin, saying, "He can give you everything he can't." I walked away without fighting. 5 years later, at a luxury event I owned, they froze when they saw who I was married to. I, 26 was having dinner at my parents' house when I noticed something off about the way everyone was acting around my girlfriend. She'd been quiet all evening, barely touching her food, and my mother kept giving her these meaningful looks across the table. My cousin sat there with this smug expression, talking loudly about his new promotion at his father's investment firm. After dinner, I went to grab my jacket from the guest room and heard voices coming from the kitchen. I moved closer and recognized my mother's voice, then my father's, and my girlfriend's soft responses. My mother was telling her that she needed to think practically about her future. My father added that my cousin could provide stability, a house, travel, everything a young woman could want. They asked her what kind of life she thought I could give her on a junior architect's salary. My girlfriend said something I couldn't quite hear, and then my mother's voice got firmer, saying she was wasting her prime years on someone who might never amount to much. I stood there in the hallway, feeling like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed. My cousin walked past me toward the kitchen, and I realized this wasn't some spontaneous conversation. This had been planned. I walked in just as my cousin was putting his hand on my girlfriend's shoulder, telling her he'd always admired her and that he could show her what real success looked like. My parents looked startled to see me, but not ashamed. My father actually told me to be reasonable, that this was about my girlfriend's well-being. My mother said I should want what's best for her. My girlfriend looked at me with tears in her eyes, and I waited for her to say something, to tell them this was insane. But she just stood there, and I understood. The seed had been planted, and part of her was actually considering it. I told them all I wasn't going to fight for someone who needed to be convinced to stay. I looked at my girlfriend and said if she wanted to explore what my cousin could offer, she should go ahead. Then I left my parents' house and didn't look back. My girlfriend called me later that night, crying, saying she never wanted this, that my parents had been talking to her for weeks, wearing her down. She said she loved me. I told her that love wasn't something you shopped around for better offers on. I told her I hoped she'd be happy, and I ended the call. Within a month, she was dating my cousin. My parents called it a natural progression and suggested I attend family dinners to show there were no hard feelings. I stopped going to family events entirely. My younger sister was the only one who reached out, telling me how messed up the whole situation was, but even she couldn't understand why I was cutting everyone off so completely. I threw myself into work with an intensity that probably wasn't healthy. I took every extra project, volunteered for the assignments no one else wanted, stayed late, came in early. My boss noticed and started giving me more responsibility. When a position opened up to lead the design on a luxury residential project, I was ready. That project led to another, then another. 2 years after the breakup, I moved to a different city for a major opportunity. A development company wanted someone to head their architectural design division, and they were willing to invest in bold, innovative projects. I met someone there, a woman who worked in sustainable building consulting. She was brilliant, driven, and had zero interest in comparing me to anyone else. We understood each other's ambitions. When I told her about my family situation, she just nodded and said some people see relationships as transactions, but that said more about them than about me. We got married quietly, just us and a few close friends. I didn't tell my family. My sister found out through social media and called me, hurt that she wasn't invited, but understanding when I explained I wanted something untainted by all that history. The company I worked for grew rapidly. My designs were getting attention, awards, features in architectural magazines. When the CEO started talking about retirement, he approached me about buying into the company as a partner. I'd been saving aggressively, investing carefully, and I had some leverage. Within another 2 years, I was a majority shareholder. We rebranded, expanded, and started taking on the kind of prestige projects that get you invited to exclusive industry events. 5 years after I walked out of my parents' kitchen, I was hosting a launch event for our newest luxury development, a mixed-use property that had taken 3 years to complete. It was the kind of place my cousin used to brag about visiting. Now I owned it. We'd rented out one of the penthouse spaces for the evening, brought in caterers, invited clients, investors, press, and industry people. My wife was with me, stunning in a dress she'd designed herself through a sustainable fashion connection, making conversation with a group of developers who were clearly charmed by her. I was talking to a potential investor when I saw them walk in. My parents, my cousin, and his date. It took me a second to realize his date was my ex-girlfriend. They'd actually gotten married, according to my sister's occasional updates. They hadn't been invited to this event. My assistant came over and quietly told me they'd come with the Hendersons, a client family my parents apparently knew socially. My mother saw me first. I watched her face change as recognition hit. She grabbed my father's arm, and he looked over. Then my cousin noticed, and his expression went from curious to shocked. My ex-girlfriend went pale. They stood there, frozen, while I excused myself from my conversation and walked over. My mother recovered first and started to smile, opening her arms like she expected a hug. I put out my hand for a formal handshake instead and introduced myself as the host and owner. My father's eyes widened. He asked if I worked here, and I told him I owned the development company. My cousin looked like he'd been slapped. He started to say something about how well I'd done for myself, his tone patronizing, still trying to position himself above me. I thanked him politely and asked how his job at his father's firm was going. He said it was going well, that he was senior management now. I nodded and mentioned that we were looking for investment partners, if his firm was interested in reviewing our portfolio. The power dynamic shift was so obvious that even he couldn't pretend not to notice it. My ex-girlfriend hadn't said anything. She was staring at me like she was seeing a ghost. My mother started asking why I hadn't told them about all this, why I'd stayed away, acting hurt and confused. I told her I'd been busy building something, and that I'd found it easier to focus without family obligations. My wife appeared at my elbow, slipping her hand into mine and asking if I was going to introduce her to these people. I introduced them as family I hadn't seen in several years. She smiled warmly and said she'd heard some stories. My mother asked what kind of stories, her voice tight. My wife said she'd heard about how families sometimes don't recognize potential when it's right in front of them, but that it often works out for the best. The Hendersons came over then, greeting me enthusiastically and thanking me for the invitation. Mrs. Henderson mentioned she'd brought some friends, gesturing to my parents, and I said that was fine. That family was always welcome at our events. The word family seemed to hit my parents hard. My father asked if we could talk privately, and I told him I had hosting duties, but perhaps we could arrange something another time. My cousin was trying to act casual, asking questions about the property, the development timeline, the investment structure. Each answer made it clearer just how far beyond him I'd moved. His wife, my ex-girlfriend, finally spoke, saying it was good to see me doing so well. Her voice was small. I thanked her and said I hoped she was happy. She didn't answer. My mother tried a different approach, getting emotional, saying she'd missed me, that they'd made mistakes but family should forgive. I told her forgiveness wasn't the issue. The issue was that I'd built a life that worked for me, with people who valued me for who I was, not for how I compared to someone else. I said I was open to rebuilding something eventually, but it would have to be on honest terms. They left not long after that. My sister texted me an hour later saying our parents had called her, upset and confused about seeing me at some fancy event. She asked if I was the one who owned the building they'd been touring with the Hendersons. I told her I was. She called immediately, laughing and crying at the same time, saying she couldn't believe I'd done all this without telling anyone. I explained that I needed to do it without their voices in my head, without the comparisons and the doubt. Update 1. The event ended well past midnight. My wife and I got home exhausted but satisfied. The launch had been a success. We'd secured 2 new investment commitments, and the press coverage was going to be excellent. But I couldn't stop thinking about my parents' faces, that mixture of shock and something that might have been regret. My sister called the next morning asking if we could meet for coffee. She said our parents wanted to talk to me, that they were trying to process everything, and that our mother had apparently cried all night. I told her I'd meet with her, but I wasn't ready to see our parents yet. We met at a cafe near my office. My sister hugged me tight and told me she was proud of me, but also frustrated that I'd shut her out too. I apologized and explained that I needed to completely separate myself from that entire dynamic. She understood, but made me promise not to disappear again. She told me what had happened after they left the event. My parents had apparently sat in their car for an hour, not speaking. My cousin had been defensive, insisting that he'd still accomplished plenty, that his career was solid. My ex-girlfriend had been quiet, just staring out the window. When they dropped my parents off, my mother had asked my ex-girlfriend if she'd known how successful I'd become. She'd said no, that she'd assumed I was doing okay, but nothing like this. My sister said our mother kept asking how she hadn't known, how I'd managed to build all of this without anyone hearing about it. I explained that I'd used my middle name professionally for the first few years, partly for branding, but partly because I wanted to succeed without the family name attached. By the time I switched back to using my full name, I was established enough that they weren't in circles where they'd hear about it. My father called me that afternoon. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message saying he wanted to apologize, that he'd been wrong about a lot of things, and that he hoped we could talk. I saved the message but didn't call back. My wife asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I honestly didn't know. Part of me felt vindicated, proven right in a way that was deeply satisfying. But another part just felt tired. She said I didn't have to make any decisions immediately, that I could take time to figure out what kind of relationship, if any, I wanted with them going forward. Update 2. 3 weeks after the event, I agreed to meet my parents for dinner. Neutral location, my choice of restaurant, my wife coming with me. My mother cried when she saw me. My father looked older than I remembered, more uncertain. They were polite to my wife, almost overly so, like they were afraid of saying the wrong thing. We ordered food, made small talk about nothing important, and then my father said they owed me an apology. My mother nodded, crying again. My father said they'd thought they were helping, that they'd genuinely believed my cousin could provide a better life for my girlfriend, and that I'd understand eventually. He said they'd been wrong, not just about my potential, but about what mattered. He said they'd treated my relationship like a business transaction and destroyed it in the process. My mother said she'd been ashamed when she saw me at that event, ashamed of how she'd acted, how she'd interfered. She said she'd been replaying that night in the kitchen for 5 years, convinced I'd just been stubborn and prideful. Seeing what I'd built made her realize I hadn't been stubborn, I'd been right. I asked them why they'd done it, why they'd pushed so hard for my cousin, why my relationship hadn't been worth respecting. My father admitted that my cousin's father, his brother, had always been the successful one, and he'd internalized that as his own failure. He'd projected that onto me, assumed I'd follow his path of moderate success rather than exceeding it. My mother said she'd wanted security for my girlfriend because she'd never had it herself, and she'd equated money with security without considering anything else. I told them that what had hurt most wasn't that they'd thought I wouldn't be successful. It was that they'd valued success over loyalty, over love, over basic respect for my choices. I told them they'd treated my relationship like it was disposable, and in doing so, they'd made themselves disposable to me. They both looked devastated. My mother asked if I could ever forgive them. I told her I already had, in the sense that I wasn't angry anymore. But forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and it didn't mean going back to how things were. I said if they wanted to be part of my life going forward, it would have to be on the understanding that they didn't get to have opinions about my choices, my career, or my relationships. They'd lost that privilege. My father agreed immediately. My mother asked if that meant she couldn't be excited about my success or proud of me. I told her she could be, but she needed to understand that her pride now, after seeing the results, was different from trust back then, when the outcome was uncertain. She nodded, crying harder. My wife, who'd been quiet through most of this, spoke up and said that rebuilding trust would take time, but that she believed people could change if they genuinely wanted to. She said she was willing to get to know them, but that she'd be watching how they treated me, and if she saw any hint of the old patterns, she'd have no problem cutting them off herself. My parents looked almost grateful for the boundary. We didn't make any commitments that night beyond agreeing to stay in contact. No promises of regular family dinners or holidays together. Just an acknowledgement that we were starting over from scratch. Update 3. It's been 6 months since that dinner. My parents and I talk maybe once a week, mostly surface-level stuff. They came to one of our company events, stayed in the background, didn't make it about them. My mother sends my wife recipes and articles about sustainable architecture. My father asked if he could invest in one of our projects, and I told him no, that mixing family and business was exactly the kind of complication I didn't need. He respected that. My sister is thrilled to have me back in her life properly. She's met my wife several times now, and they get along well. She told me recently that our parents talk about me differently now, with a kind of cautious respect they never had before. I ran into my cousin at an industry conference 2 months ago. He was there with his father's firm, trying to network. He saw me and actually tried to approach like we were old friends. I was professional, Introduced him to some contacts since I'm not petty enough to sabotage his career, but I didn't pretend we had a relationship. His wife, my ex-girlfriend, wasn't with him. My sister mentioned they'd been having problems, that she'd apparently realized the luxury lifestyle wasn't as fulfilling as she'd thought it would be. I felt nothing hearing that. No satisfaction, no sympathy, just nothing. My wife asked me recently if I felt like I'd gotten closure. I told her I didn't need closure because I'd never really been stuck. I'd been angry for a while, then focused, then successful, and now I was just living my life. The revenge, if you could call it that, wasn't planned. It was just the natural result of refusing to accept their judgment of my worth. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I'd fought for that relationship, if I'd argued with my parents, tried to convince my girlfriend to stay. I'd probably still be proving myself to them, still measuring my success against my cousins, still seeking approval I'd never really get. Walking away was the best decision I ever made, not because of where I ended up, but because it taught me that my value wasn't up for debate. If you'd like to see more stories like this, a gentle tap on the subscribe button would mean the world to us.